ethos which will catch many of my memories. I met him personally much more towards the end of his life. I remember, for example, being at Edinburgh Airport, waiting for the arrival of the plane bringing Pope Benedict to Britain. The Duke was there on behalf of the Queen to meet the Pope at the airport, to travel back into Edinburgh with him, but not in the same car, much to his dismay. He wanted the big open-top car, but protocol hadn't allowed that. So he was full of all sorts of direct comments, as was his character, and most gracious as well, recognising, I think, the importance of the visit of Pope Benedict to so many people in this country. And of course, it was the Pope's insistence that he went first of all to meet Her Majesty the Queen and Prince Philip.
And your other interactions?
Well, I also remember, now this was not personal, but I remember perhaps most vividly of all being on one of the boats on the River Thames for that Diamond Jubilee flotilla. And I was fortunate, I was in a boat that actually had some cover in it. But he stood by the side of the Queen all that long, cold, wet afternoon. And I think everybody knows he paid for it subsequently. But to me, that's a symbol of his steadfast and generously given sense of duty. He was there by Her Majesty the Queen, as he promised and as she thanked him for in those last words that ended the last item.
Yes, that he'd been her strength and stay over
Absolutely.
all of these years. And it is it's a long life. It's a long life of public service.
It is indeed. It is, and it is an outstanding example of how I think we find often our best when we're giving to something else, when we're fulfilling our duties and being faithful and loyal. And there's no doubt, that my heart actually goes out first of all to his family, to Her Majesty the Queen, and every member of the royal family, no matter where they are. I think especially of Harry, actually, so far away in California, and his granddad has died. And I think, he will have a special place in my prayers over these next few days, and for all the royal family. This is a family in mourning, a family in grief. And as a priest, that's my first reaction is towards them.
Yes, and you mentioning Harry, one then thinks of the Duke walking by the side of his grandsons when their mother died.
Yes, exactly. And the bond between them, must be enormously deep because they were a tight-knit family and they'd been through difficult times, possibly more difficult than the average family, and often all of it in the public eye. So the bonds between them must be very deep, and his absence will be felt so deeply. Clearly, as a family, they've been preparing for this moment. It's not a surprise that he has now died, but it's still that sense of shock that ripples right through a family structure and in every member of that family. And I feel for them very deeply at this moment, as I would for any grieving family.
The statement from Buckingham Palace says it's with deep sorrow that Her Majesty the Queen announces the death of her beloved husband. You must have seen them together up close because of your role.
Yes, not very often, I shouldn't pretend, but what was perfectly clear was the geometry of it. The Queen would come, he would be a step or two behind, and never absent, but there, in that kind of choreography position of absolute support, but not seeking the limelight, not seeking any preeminence. He knew how to get the limelight. He knew how to make a remark that would catch people's attention. But it was his sense of giving support to his beloved wife and to our beloved Queen that was uppermost, that shaped the man all the way through. And he knew it from the word go. He must have known when he, married her that this would be for the rest of his life. And that he was faithful is so important a lesson for us to learn. So thankful to God for such a solid companion, a loving companion for Her Majesty the Queen, enabling her to fulfill the role that she does for us all.
Cardinal Vincent Nichols, Bishop of Westminster, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
I think we've reported already that Parliament will reconvene on Monday. That's a day earlier, out of the Easter recess. We have a statement from the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle. Prince Philip's performed wide-ranging official roles, carrying out thousands of engagements and overseas visits on behalf of the UK and the Commonwealth. He'll be remembered for loyal devotion to service and his leadership of hundreds of ideals and causes close to his heart. We're still joined by Johnny Diamond, BBC Royal Correspondent. I mean, clearly, Johnny, the nation is going to be very preoccupied over the next few days, but it is a strange time. We're not out of this pandemic. Public gatherings not encouraged.
No, and the palace has long been aware of this, acutely aware of the circumstances in which the prince might die. And acutely aware of the need to make sure that there will be no great gatherings. This will not see, for example, the notice outside Buckingham Palace. It's gone out, but it was only up for 1 hour. Normally it would be up for at least 24 hours. We'll not see, for example, physical condolence books. I think arrangements for whatever funeral takes place will be very different from what might have been. And you know what, in its own way, that might be something which the Duke would approve of, because despite the fact that he sat through countless speeches and endless ceremony, he pretty much loathed them, and he made it very clear. I mean, he once said that he was opening a building, I'm here to open a building that's been open for 6 months. I'm not quite sure why I'm here.
Deconstructing the process of modern royalty.
Indeed. Yeah. I mean, let me just pick up something you said there as well about the tributes that are coming in, and one's just come up here in front of me. And it's from the Irish President, President Higgins. And of course, the Queen's visit to Ireland in 2011 was a pretty important moment in bringing together the two countries in our long and very tangled history. And President Higgins says that his hope is that the visits made in 2011 and the visit he made in 2014, which he shared, will continue to be symbols of what we share as neighbours in friendship, peace and a sustainable future. Again, it is that reminder that at nearly every stage, whatever the Queen did, Prince Philip was there, and many times when the Queen was not there, during the dissolution of empire, for example, during the 1960s and 1970s, there was Prince Philip, a life led in duty and service, and a life led at an astonishing pace with astonishing energy as well.
Thanks, Johnny.
And Laura Koonsberg, our political editor, is on the line now. Laura, of course, as you would expect, we've had, from across the political spectrum here, reflections on the death of His Royal Highness.
Yes, I mean, almost every UK political leader was extremely quick to respond to the sad news that when it came from Windsor earlier, the Prime Minister leading those tributes in a public statement at the lectern outside Number 10, paying tribute to the longest serving consort. He talked of the Duke of Edinburgh as having been as an expert carriage driver, and he'd used that skill to help steer the royal family and the country through the decades, making sure that the monarchy remained, in his words, indisputably vital in the life of our country. And Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, said that the country has lost an extraordinary public servant in Prince Philip, who dedicated his life to the country. Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, said that she was saddened by the news and wanted to send personal and deepest condolences to Her Majesty and the rest of the royal family. A long list of tributes that have poured in. But really, most political leaders reflecting not just on the news today, but the constancy and the sheer length of public service that the Duke of Edinburgh had provided to the country. You know, born in 1921, when Lloyd George was the Prime Minister, another man of great energy who enjoyed occasionally cocking a snook at convention, I think about 21 Prime Ministers later, you know, that extraordinary lifespan of somebody who was at the Queen's side, and part, therefore, of the permanence of the monarchy really as an institution, which is so often a contrast to the frenzy of modern politics. But the words of the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, today, saying that we must pause this afternoon to pay tribute as a nation.
Laura Koonsberg, thank you.
It's 2:30 now. You're listening to BBC News, broadcasting a special programme across all BBC radio networks following the announcement of the death of His Royal Highness, the Duke of Edinburgh. Let's get the headlines now with Tom Sanders.
Buckingham Palace has announced that the Duke of Edinburgh has died. Prince Philip was 99 and the longest-serving consort in British history. The Queen and the Duke were married for more than 70 years, and Prince Philip dedicated decades of his life to royal duty, serving at the monarch's side before retiring from public engagements in the summer of 2017. In a statement, the palace said it was with deep sorrow that Her Majesty the Queen announced the death of her beloved husband, His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. The statement said he had passed away peacefully this morning at Windsor Castle. The Union flag at Buckingham Palace has been lowered to half-mast. The Duke had returned to Windsor Castle just over 3 weeks ago after spending a month in hospital. He initially received care for an infection before undergoing heart surgery. Boris Johnson said the Duke would be remembered above all for his steadfast support for the Queen. He said Prince Philip was a much-loved and highly respected public figure. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, said the UK had lost an extraordinary public servant who dedicated his life to the country. Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, sent her deepest personal condolences to the Queen and the royal family. The First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford, said Prince Philip had served the Crown with selfless devotion. Northern Ireland's First Minister, Arlene Foster, said her sadness would be shared by countless others in Northern Ireland and right across the world. While Northern Ireland's Deputy First Minister, Michelle O'Neill, extended her sincere condolences. In a speech to celebrate their golden wedding anniversary in 1997, the Queen described Prince Philip as her strength and stay. Sarah Bradford, historian and royal biographer, said the Queen and Prince Philip had a great and long partnership.
She fell for Philip when she saw him, well, you have to say, showing off by jumping over a tennis net. And she said, "Oh, look at Philip. Isn't he good how high he can jump?" etc. And that's, she admitted, was when she fell for him, and she was only 15 years old.
Sarah Bradford there. You're listening to BBC News, broadcasting a special programme across all BBC radio networks following the announcement of the death of His Royal Highness, the Duke of Edinburgh. If you look at the royal family's website, royal.uk, you'll see that there is a black page with an image of the Duke and 1921 to 2021, the dates of his life. He was 99, the longest-serving consort in British history. The Duke and the Queen were married for more than 70 years. Prince Philip dedicated decades of his life to royal duty, serving the nation at the monarch's side. He was seen as a strong-willed and independent man, but he once told his biographer that he believed his job was to ensure the Queen can reign. When he was asked to sum up his own contribution, he did so in typically forthright style.
I've just done what I think is my best, and some people think it was all right, other people quite evidently don't. What can you do? I can't suddenly change my whole way of doing things. I can't change my interests. I can't change the way in which I react to things. That's part of that's somebody's style, and it's too bad. Lump it.
Lump it. Well, Prince Philip gained a reputation for speaking his mind. We've heard a lot of that in the last couple of hours. He wasn't afraid to share opinions on any subject, and also had a dry sense of humour, which was typified by his response to an American TV interviewer in the 1960s when he was asked about pressures on the royal finances.
No question. Just we get a lump sum, we can do it lightly. The thing is that it's allocated for particular purposes. Now, inevitably, if nothing happens, we shall either have to we may have to move into smaller premises, you know.
Well, his greatest support was reserved for the Queen, a fact that she acknowledged in a speech she made on the occasion of their golden wedding anniversary in 1997.
He has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years, and I and his whole family owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim or we shall ever know.
A very important quote that we've heard that referred to already. In a BBC interview to mark his 90th birthday, he did speak about his advancing years and announced that he'd decided to reduce his schedule, declaring that it was better, in his words, to get out before you reach your sell-by date.
I reckon I've done my bit. I want to enjoy myself for a bit now. With less responsibility, less frantic rushing about, less preparation, less trying to think of something to say.
top of that, memories going. I can't remember names and these. Yes, I'm just sort of winding down.
Winding down. Giles Brandreth is a royal biographer, broadcaster, and knew the Duke of Edinburgh for many years. And Giles Brandreth, thanks so much for joining us on this sad day. And I maybe suspect you're reflecting on the relationship between and the support he gave to the Queen.
Very much so. I was lucky enough to know Prince Philip over, I suppose, nearly 5 decades. And his principal role was to support the Queen. I mean, he certainly was, as she's put it, her constant strength and guide, but he also made her laugh. They got on well together. You know, it's a unique position to be the Queen. Nobody in the world treats the Queen quite normally. Even our children bow and curtsy to her when they see her for the first time of the day. The only person who ever could be totally normal with the Queen was Prince Philip. And the only person who could ever say to Prince Philip, "Oh, Philip, do shut up," was the Queen. And she did. I remember once when I was following them during one of the Jubilee tours, and I was in the car behind theirs, and they'd had a long day touring whatever part of the country it was separately, but they came together at the end of the day to drive back to Windsor, wherever it was. And I was in the car behind, and they got into the car together, and he began telling her a story. She obviously asked him something, and he began telling her a story. And for 20 minutes, I just watched her laugh. And I realized this, of course, is what they had. They had something special between them. So today, while it marks the end of an era, for all of us, people of my generation, he has been there throughout our lives. But this must be such a sad, bleak day for the Queen, who has known him since she was a girl and been in love with him since the 1940s.
You've had a much more intimate peek into the relationship than most of us will get. Obviously, a lot of people are just picking up little bits from the public, what they read in the papers or what they see on these historic television dramas about the royal family. His life is clearly very relevant to people of his age cohort who've grown up with him, but also relevant to the younger generation too, in some interesting ways, most notably from the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme. But I think he is relevant to the younger Britain as well, isn't he?
Totally. Curiously, my own grandson, now 16, was in the middle this morning of doing his charity work to achieve his gold standard Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme medal this very morning when he heard the news, and he was sad. And the Duke of Edinburgh was born 100 years ago, and yet touches the lives of literally millions of young people around the world. And he did reflect his generation. Napoleon famously said that if you want to understand a man, you should look at what the world was like in the year that man turned 21. And Prince Philip turned 21 in 1942, at the height of the Second World War. And he reflected people of that era. He wasn't a touchy-feely, huggy person. He was somebody more discreet, stiff upper lip. He did his duty. He was that kind of a person, but he was also interested in the future. He was interested in people around him. He was interested in young people. He was interested in what was going to happen next. So he curiously could combine two things, the heritage, the past, and also a sense of, the modern as well.
Your impression that he was fulfilled? I mean, clearly there are frustrations in being a number two.
He would have dismissed that. People always say, "Oh, weren't you frustrated to have to give up the Navy?" And Lord Louis, who became the chief of the naval staff, told me that he served with Prince Philip as a midshipman in the 1940s. He said, had he been able to pursue his naval career, he would have undoubtedly gone to the top. And Prince Philip said to me, "No, I don't think that is so. It wouldn't have been possible. The press wouldn't have let it happen. They'd have said that was favoritism. And anyway, I knew what my future was going to be." I think the surprise for him was that King George VI died young, and therefore Prince Philip was barely 30 when he found himself as consort to the new Queen. And the challenge for him back in 1952 was that there was a set role for the Queen, but what was he to do? And he had to, in a way, invent his own role. And that's what he did, and so successfully. I mean, if we regard the Queen's reign as a success, and most people do, the joint author of that success is undoubtedly Prince Philip.
I'm looking at some of the things foreign newspapers are saying because they give you an interesting perspective on how the world sees the man. Some very obvious themes. The Times of India reports his tough, no-nonsense attitude, propensity for occasional gaffes. The Sydney Morning Herald said Australians appreciated the Duke's irreverent directness. I mean, there's a lot more to him than that irreverence, isn't there? But that obviously is going to be, if you like, for those who have a two-dimensional picture of a royal member, it's going to be part of it.
He was very frustrated by those gaffes and the way they were reported, because he explained to me when I asked him about them, he said, you know, you meet in my position, you meet literally hundreds of people, thousands of people, and, you know, you try to break the ice by making the odd joke or quip, and, you know, once in a while it goes wrong, you say something that's a bit tactless, and then it gets reported all over the world. He found that very frustrating because he made it a kind of rule. He said, when I go down a line, shaking hands, I do try to at least make one of the people there laugh. And sometimes it misfires. So those gaffes of his, they said, he knew. He said, you know, when the day comes and I go, that's what it'll be about, all those gaffes. And he knew that frustrated him. But he was accepting it. He accepted it. What was interesting about him is he wasn't really very interested in himself. He didn't watch The Crown. He didn't watch documentaries about himself. He was interested in the world around him, in the world beyond him, science, nature, art, other people. He always said, it was advice he gave his children, and I imagine he would have given his grandchildren, don't talk about yourself. No one's interested.
It's not about you. Well, actually, of course, the world is very, very, very interested. I'll just give you a comment here from the New York Times, because this is an interesting one too. The first gentleman of the land, he shepherded the 20th century, a monarchy encrusted with the trappings of the 19th, so taking the monarchy from the 19th to the 20th. But then the New York Times says this, as pageantry was upstaged by scandal, as regal weddings were followed by divorces, his mission changed. Now it was time to preserve the crown itself. Well, it's a view, I suppose, of his life and what has happened to the royal family over these years. But obviously it has been there have been some challenging periods for the family.
Well, the truth is, when he came in, he very much was a modernizer. He arrived at Buckingham Palace and couldn't believe that there they all were, still in powdered wigs. You know, flunkies literally he felt from the 19th century. He did try to pull Buckingham Palace into the 20th century with a lot of resistance from some of the people, some of the courtiers of the time. And of course, it was the age of deference. And that has changed as the years have gone by. But I think he knew that the success of the royal family, you've got to remember, he was totally royal. The Queen, let's face it, is only half royal. She's royal on her father's side, but her mother was an aristocrat. Both the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, great-great-grandchildren of Queen Victoria. But on the Duke's side, on both his mother's and his father's side, he is royal. He understood royalty to his fingertips, but he knew how it adapted. And as he said to me, you know, at the time of the divorces of Sarah Ferguson and Diana, Princess of Wales, he said, you know, we are a family. These things happen. And the royal family, in a way, part of its success is that it reflects and continues to reflect the changing world. And he was able to do that. He kept up with the times, and he kept the ship steady all those years. He really was the strength and stay of the Queen throughout her reign.
Giles Brandreth, good to talk to you on a sad day.
The Duke of Edinburgh was a man who pursued many interests in his time, among them technology and engineering, also leadership, citizenship, resilience. You could see that in his setting up of the Duke of Edinburgh Awards scheme, and a patron and supporter of a whole range of different charities. Shakespeare's Globe on the South Bank, he was a patron of that theatre for more than 40 years. And he was strongly identified with the environment and conservation, wildlife conservation in particular. He was heavily involved with the World Wildlife Fund, which later changed its name to the Worldwide Fund for Nature. And he was president of the Zoological Society of London from 1960 to 1977, and then later an honorary fellow. Dominic Jermy's on the line. He's the Director General of London Zoo. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Michelle.
How important was he to ZSL?
The Duke of Edinburgh had a transformational impact on ZSL. So as you said, he was our president for 17 years, but actually he has been a lifelong supporter for all the work that we do, the science and the conservation, and bringing his children to our zoos, London and Westmead zoos.
Did you get to meet him?
And so I've actually met him in a previous role when I was British ambassador to the United Arab Emirates, and he and Her Majesty the Queen came on a state visit to the UAE. But at ZSL, his most recent visit was opening, with Her Majesty the Queen, opening our Centre for Elephant Care in 2017. And there was just the most gorgeous photograph of him extending a banana to one of our elephants, Donna, that I think was on all the front pages the following day.
It must have been one of his last public engagements, was it? Because that was the year that he officially retired from public life.
It must have been, and really we feel really honoured that he was willing to come and do that. He and Her Majesty the Queen come and do that for us then. While he was president, he was involved in all sorts of initiatives in supporting zoology, and you mentioned the Duke of Edinburgh Awards. With us, he was encouraging young people to engage on the environment and on saving wildlife. And thinking back to this was the 1960s, the 1970s. This was long before this had been something kind of on trend. He really was a pioneer in for example, setting up a prize to support young zoologists and to encourage them. And it was a prize that a sixth former known as Chris Packham won when he was back at school in the 1970s.
Yes, that's really important, isn't it? Because one should remember the time that he took up the cause of wildlife conservation, where it really needed to gain more prominence and to have high profile supporters who were prepared to use their influence and their access to put this issue more firmly on an international agenda.
That's absolutely right. And there are so many people at ZSL, at both our zoos now, who remember the passion and the conviction that he expressed when he was talking about wildlife in those days as our president. This was something that it wasn't just another interest. This was something that was absolutely central to his view of how we as custodians of nature ought to be looking after this incredible environment that we've inherited and to be leaving it in a better place than we find it.
And you have a library, don't you, named after him at ZSL?
We do indeed. And like the Institute of Zoology that was set up when he was president, the library is another example of how his legacy will live with us for many decades to come, and how people, when they are going to the library, many students, many fellows, members of the public, they have that opportunity. They go in, they pass his name a plaque commemorating his commitment to zoology and wildlife. They've got a moment when they can just pause and reflect on this man who's had such an amazing impact, for positive impact on wildlife conservation.
Dominic Jeremy, Director General of London Zoo, thank you.
It's 11 minutes to 3. If you are just tuning in, you may be expecting to hear your BBC radio station. This is, though, a BBC News special. We're in special programming across all the BBC radio networks following the announcement of the death of His Royal Highness, the Duke of Edinburgh, reflecting on and remembering the Duke. Johnny Diamond, BBC Royal Correspondent, is here with Michelle Hacene and myself, Evan Davis. Johnny, I see the College of Arms are actually beginning to talk about the fact that there will not be any lying in state and there will not be a state funeral. They say that's in line with his wishes. I'm just literally seeing that flash up on Reuters, Noel, as we speak.
Yeah, and as we discussed a few moments ago, this is a man who, despite the fact he sat through so much ceremony, actively disliked it. I understand, as is the case with senior members of the royal family, the arrangements for his passing have been agreed with him, and that, yes, no lying in state and a simpler funeral